This is Crane Park Nature Reserve in the most westerly part of Twickenham. Today it is a peaceful haven for wildlife, but 100 years ago this was the site of Hounslow Gunpowder Mills, where hundreds of men and boys worked on a huge site with buildings scattered over almost 100 acres. The work was so dangerous that the buildings were separated by stands of trees and blast mounds of earth which would limit the damage from the explosions. And explosions happened horribly regularly from when the powder mills opened in 1766 right up until 1917, when the last man was killed. In 1859, 7 men were killed in a single explosion, which could be heard in central London and was reported in the Times. Local celebrities wrote about the destruction. In 1772, the writer Horace Walpole complained to his friend Seymour Conway that the decorative glass was blown out of the windows of his home at Strawberry Hill House, several miles away in Twickenham. So why were there gunpowder mills in Twickenham, and what became of them? In the 18th century, Twickenham was on the edge of Hounslow Heath, a wild open area notorious for highwaymen such as Dick Turpin, who preyed on coaches on their journey towards the West Country. Hounslow Heath was a relatively isolated area. It also had the River Crane running through it, which could provide power to the mills. The mills were actually within the parish of Twickenham, but closer to the village of Hounslow, and became known as Hounslow Powder Mills. Over the last 90 years, nature has overtaken the mills, but there is still plenty of evidence of the gunpowder works, including what is now known as the Shot Tower. Making gunpowder was big business in the 18th century when the mills opened, at a time when the British Empire was aggressively expanding and fighting all over the world. The Hounslow Mill is thought to have been founded around 1766 by Edmund Hill, who owned it until 1800. The longest owners were Curtis and Harvey, who ran it for almost 100 years, from 1820 until 1918. Gunpowder had been invented in China in the 9th century and was written about by Roger Bacon in England in 1267. Guns and artillery came to dominate warfare in the 17th century, so there was a huge demand for gunpowder. Gunpowder is made from 3 ingredients: 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal and 10% sulphur. Saltpeter is a complicated substance to make. It is found naturally as a product of degradation of animal manure and was made by a long process of boiling up earth that had been saturated with manure and then purifying the resulting liquor. It took days of boiling and purifying, a process called lixiviating, before the pure white powder was produced. It was made at the gunpowder works, but was also imported in huge quantities from Bengal in India by the East India Company. Charcoal was made by burning locally grown alder and willow in iron ovens with very little air. Sulphur was imported from the volcanoes of Italy and was purified on site. The ingredients were all mixed together in incorporating mills. These were circular troughs that contained the dampened ingredients. A pair of edge runner stones rolled over the mixture, pressing it and mixing it. A type of plough would push the mixture from the edge of the trough under the wheels. These mills were powered by water until the 1850s, when steam power was introduced. The next stage was to press the mixture to increase its density to ensure that the powder would burn correctly. The incorporated mixture was layered between copper sheets and squeezed by hydraulic presses. The result was a hard pressed cake which was hard like slate. The next stage was called corning and was the most dangerous. The hard cake was broken up with wooden mallets. It was then pressed through sieves to create pellets like grains of corn. The sieves were shaken on wooden frames by water power. The corned powder was dried on trays in a room with the back end of a stove projecting through the wall. The final stage was to tumble the corn powder inside a rotating cylinder to round off any corners from the pellets to make a smooth grain. This process could take many hours. The finished powder was then packed into wooden barrels and was taken by cart to Isleworth, where it was shipped to London by barge. Explosions are regular events, and there were over 100 fatalities over the lifetime of the mills. The men were all local, from Hounslow, Feltham, Witton, Hanworth and Twickenham. In the 19th century, it was the biggest local employer, with over 300 workers from the local villages. The complex processes took place in many buildings, spread out over more than 100 acres, widely separated to reduce the impact of explosions. In 1869, 3 men and a boy died in an explosion in a glazing house. The flash from the explosion travelled 150 metres over the mill pond and ignited powder in an underground store. 15-year-old Albert Holloway was passing on a horse and was killed. The mill pond wall was blown down and the pond flooded the lower parts of the works. In 1852, a visit to the Hounslow Mill is described in Charles Dickens' Household Words magazine. On approaching the saltpetre mill, we stopped at a broad platform, apparently of slate, laid down in front of the entrance, and, before permitted to step upon it, our boots are carefully encased in a pair of India rubber overshoes. The mill where the saltpetre is ground is a small house where 2 huge circular stones, as large in circumference as the hind wheels of a great wagon, 11 or 12 inches in thickness, each weighing about 6 tons. Men with wooden shovels feed the bed beneath the rolling stones from time to time, keeping the powdered saltpetre in its place, while a man and a boy in a second room cast it up against a slanted sieve of fine wire, so as to sift it clear of any larger grains or any refuse. The faces of the 2 men and the boy engaged in this process are begrimed like a goblin with white dust. Behind me is what is known as a shot tower, which may have been used for making lead shot for shooting cartridges. It was definitely a bell tower. It definitely had a clock in it at one stage for the workers to look at, but it also may have been the site of a windmill to power a scoop mill for lifting up water to provide extra power for the windmills. Shot towers were invented for making small lead shot for shooting game. Molten lead would be poured through a colander at the top of the tower and it would fall to become spherical in shape. At the bottom it would fall into a tank of water and then be taken out, sorted and graded. Most shot towers in Britain were at least 150 foot tall, as this was the height needed for the production of large shot. The tower in Lambeth, which was demolished in 1967, was over 160 feet tall. The Hounslow Mills tower is only 80 feet tall, which is insufficient to make lead shot. Dickens' Household Words magazine describes a big scoop wheel at the mills. It was probably used when the flow of the crane was low and the wheel raised water to a pond to supply water for the grinding mills. So it would probably be better to call it the watchtower or bell tower rather than the shot tower. The site of the mills was bought by Twickenham Council in the 1930s and turned into a park. The buildings were demolished and many of the waterways filled in. The mill pond was planted as reed beds in the 1980s and is now a nature reserve. Peace has now returned to the River Crane and kingfishers can be seen flying fast down the river. Most people enjoying a walk in the woods don't know that it was once the biggest private powder mill in the country and an explosive part of Twickenham's past.